My name is Teven Oral. I am a human. I am 41 years old. I was born in the city of Nairobi on the planet Earth, and I have lived on Earth my entire life, except for 4 years during my military service, and 2 years working as a civilian contractor for the Outer Systems Logistics Bureau. And I am standing in front of this council today, not because I was a soldier in the battle you are asking about, and not because I had any authority over the decisions that were made, and not because anyone has ever accused me of doing anything wrong. I am standing here because I was there. I was on the orbital platform Meridian Station, which sits at the edge of Earth's detection range, running inventory on a shipment of construction materials bound for the Callisto project, when the Neth sovereignty fleet arrived. I watched the whole thing. I am the only non-combatant who did. And I have been told that what this council needs, after 3 years of military testimony and strategic analysis and political argument about what happened and why and what it means, is someone who was simply there and simply watched and can simply tell you what they saw. So that is what I am going to do. I am going to tell you what I saw. I am going to tell it plainly and in order, and I am going to tell you everything I remember, which is everything, because it is not the kind of thing you forget. The fleet arrived at 3:47 station time, which was the middle of my sleep cycle, and the first I knew of it was the proximity alarm on the station's passive sensor array, which I had access to because the inventory work I was doing required monitoring the approach corridors for incoming supply vessels. The alarm was not designed for what it was detecting. It had been calibrated for civilian traffic, transports and survey ships, and the occasional commission inspection vessel, and the thing it was now detecting was so far outside those calibration parameters that the alarm did not know what tone to use and cycled through 4 different alert levels in the span of about 3 seconds before settling on the highest one it had, which was a sound I had never heard before in 2 years on the station. I was out of my bunk before I was fully awake. I reached the monitoring station and looked at the display, and I stood there for a moment just looking at it, because the display was showing me something that I did not immediately know how to read. There were so many contacts that the sensor array's contact separation algorithm had stopped trying to distinguish between them, and was displaying them as a single mass return with a quantity estimate beside it. The estimate said, greater than 400. I read it twice. Then I opened a channel to the station commander and told her what the display was showing. She told me to stay at my station and not use any active sensors and not transmit anything on standard frequencies. I did what she said. I watched the display. The mass return kept moving, slow and steady and enormous, toward Earth. Admiral Crethvor of the Neth Sovereignty 5th Assault Armada had been planning this operation for 6 years. I know this now. I did not know it at the time, but the documents released after the engagement detailed the planning process extensively, and I have read them, and the picture they paint is of a military commander who was thorough, experienced, and operating with a degree of confidence that, given everything he knew, was not unreasonable. The Neth Sovereignty's intelligence on human military capability was accurate, but incomplete in a specific way that the intelligence apparatus had never identified as a gap, because filling the gap would have required them to think about humanity differently than they were accustomed to thinking about species they intended to conquer. Their intelligence told them about the human fleet's size, its armament, its organizational structure, the location of its major bases and shipyards and command installations. Their intelligence told them the names of human admirals and their tactical records and their known strategic preferences. Their intelligence told them about the human defense platforms in Earth orbit and the weapon systems those platforms carried and the effective range of those systems. All of this was accurate. What the intelligence did not tell them, because it is not something that shows up in the kind of data military intelligence services collect, was what it felt like to be on the receiving end of a decision made by 412 human warships in the first 3 seconds after an enemy fleet appears on their sensors. It did not tell them that because there was no one in the Neth Sovereignty who had experienced it and survived to report it, there is now. The station commander came to the monitoring room at 4:12. She looked at my display for a long time without saying anything. The mass return was closer now, and the sensor array had recalibrated itself in. To start separating individual contacts at the leading edge of the fleet. I could see the ship classifications beginning to populate alongside the contact markers. Dreadnought, carrier, heavy cruiser, dreadnought. They just kept coming. The commander watched the display populate for about 2 minutes, and then she said, very quietly, that she was going to send me to the emergency shelter on the station's lower level, and that I should take whatever personal items were important to me and I should go now. I said I would like to stay at the monitoring station. She looked at me for a moment, and then she said, the shelter is rated for everything short of a direct strike. I said I understood. She said, I am not ordering you to go. I am telling you the option exists. I said I would stay. She nodded and pulled up a chair and sat down next to me, and we watched the display together. Neither of us said anything for a while. Then she said, Earth is going to know they're here in about 4 minutes. I said, what happens then? She said, then we find out. I said, find out what? She said, what we're made of. Earth knew. The Planetary Detection Network, which in the years following the establishment of formal galactic contact had been rebuilt from scratch with technology and funding that had been treated as the single most important infrastructure project in human history, picked up the fleet at 4:16. I know the exact time because the station received the detection confirmation automatically as part of the Orbital Defense Coordination System, a timestamp in the lower corner of my display that I have not been able to stop seeing when I close my eyes, even now, 3 years later, 4:16. And then, because I was watching the right display at the right moment, I saw something that I do not think anyone else outside the military command structure saw in real time. The human fleet, which had been distributed across the solar system in its standard peacetime deployment pattern, began to move. Not chaotically, not in the scrambling, reactive way you might expect from a force that has just detected 412 enemy warships arriving without warning. It moved the way something moves when it has been waiting for a reason to move, with a purposefulness that was immediately different from normal navigation traffic in a way I could feel before I could articulate it. The contacts on my display, tagged with human vessel identifiers, were converging. From the outer planets, from the asteroid installations, from the Lagrange points and the lunar facilities and the orbital platforms that ringed Earth like a string of lights, they were all moving in the same general direction, toward the approaching fleet, and the convergence had the quality of something that had been planned, the quality of vectors that someone had already calculated, that were already loaded into navigation systems, waiting for exactly this sensor reading to execute. I asked the station commander if the military had a plan for this. She said every military has a plan for everything. I said, do they have a good one? She said, I have no idea. I'm inventory and logistics, same as you. Then she said, but look at how they're moving. I looked. The human vessels were still converging, faster now as drives came fully online, and the pattern of the convergence was becoming clearer on the display. They were not massing in front of Earth to defend it. They were moving to intercept the Neth sovereignty fleet at a point well outside Earth's orbit, which meant they were not thinking about defense at all. They were thinking about engagement, about meeting the fleet where it was rather than where it was going. I said, they're going toward them. She said, yes. I said, is that smart? She said, it means the fight doesn't happen near the planet. I thought about that. I said, they planned for this. She said, they planned for something. Maybe not this specific fleet, but something. She pointed to the convergence pattern on the display, the way the human vessels were arranging themselves as they moved, the spacing and the groupings, and the way the larger vessels were positioning relative to the smaller ones. She said, look at how clean that is. You don't move like that in a surprise situation unless you've run the scenario before. I looked. She was right. It was clean. It was very clean. Admiral Krethvor's fleet dropped to sublight velocity at 4:41 and began its final approach configuration. I know from the documents released afterward that this was the moment when his sensors gave him the first complete picture of what the human fleet was doing, and that his staff spent approximately 7 minutes processing the data and updating their tactical projections before he was given a revised engagement assessment. The revised assessment told him that the human fleet had achieved an intercept position that was tactically disadvantageous for the Neth sovereignty's approach foe. Our estimation that the humans had, in the 25 minutes since detection, repositioned their forces with a speed and precision that the assessment's authors described as exceeding modeled parameters for human fleet coordination. The assessment recommended a formation adjustment to account for the human intercept position. Admiral Krethvor approved the adjustment. The adjustment took 19 minutes to execute across 412 vessels. During those 19 minutes, the human fleet continued to move. When the Neth sovereignty's formation adjustment was complete, the human intercept position had changed again, and the tactical advantage the adjustment was designed to neutralize had shifted and expanded in ways that required another assessment and another formation consideration. I did not know any of this at the time. I was watching my display, which showed me the contact returns of both fleets, and I could see from the movement patterns that something was happening that was not the simple collision of two forces I had been expecting, that there was a quality to the human fleet's movement that was different from the Neth sovereignty fleet's movement in a way I could see but could not name. The station commander named it for me. She watched the display for a long time and then she said, "They're dancing with them." I said, "What?" She said, "The human fleet. They're not setting up a defensive line. They're not charging. They're making them react. Every time the big fleet adjusts, the human ships move again." She pointed to the display. She said, "They've been doing that for 20 minutes and the big fleet has been chasing them the whole time." The first exchange of fire happened at 5:19. I saw it on the display as a sudden cluster of contact changes, human vessel markers shifting position simultaneously, Neth sovereignty markers at the leading edge of the fleet going to damaged or destroyed status in the same window. The engagement had begun. I want to describe what it looked like on a sensor display, because it is what I saw and I can only tell you what I saw, and what it looked like was not what I expected. I expected the two fleets to close on each other and exchange fire until one of them stopped existing. That is what I had understood an engagement between large fleets to look like, from the histories I had read and the tactical briefings I had received during my military service years ago. What I actually saw looked almost nothing like that. The human fleet did not stay in one place. It moved constantly, the whole thing, not just individual ships maneuvering but the entire formation shifting and reconfiguring in ways that seemed, from the outside, almost liquid, the way a murmuration of birds moves as a collective body that no individual bird is directing. The Neth sovereignty fleet was large and it was powerful, and it was doing what large powerful fleets do, which is bring its weapons to bear and fire them. And the weapons were hitting things. Human vessel markers were going to damaged status, and some were going to destroyed. And I was watching that happen and my stomach was doing something that I will not describe in precise physiological terms, but that I think anyone watching their own species' ships being destroyed would recognize. But the Neth sovereignty fleet was also losing markers. Not as many at first, but consistently. Every time the human formation shifted, every time the liquid movement of 412 alien warships was in some way suboptimal for a moment, human weapons hit the gap, and markers went away, and the gaps closed but there were new gaps by then, and the human fleet found those too. The station commander and I did not talk much during the engagement. There was not much to say. We watched the display. We watched the markers. We watched the numbers in the corner of the display that the sensor array was updating continuously, the count of confirmed destroyed contacts on each side. And I watched that count and I understood something that I do not think I could have understood without watching it happen in real time. Something about the nature of what the human military had been building toward for the decades since galactic contact was established. They had known this was possible. They had known that something with 400 ships might arrive one day without warning, and they had spent those decades not building the biggest fleet they could, or the most powerful weapons they could, or the most impenetrable defenses they could, though they had done all of those things too. What they had built, what I was watching work in real time, was a way of fighting. A specific, practiced, deeply considered way of engaging a larger force that was based not on matching it weapon for weapon, but on making every moment of the engagement cost more than the moment was worth, on never being where the enemy expected, on turning the enemy's size from an advantage into a problem. Because use a large force has to go somewhere, and the somewhere it goes can be predicted, and the prediction can be used. I am not a military analyst. I am not claiming to fully understand what I was watching. I am telling you what it looked like to someone who was watching it without that expertise, and what it looked like was, they knew exactly what they were doing. At 6:38, 1 hour and 19 minutes into the engagement, the station commander pointed to the display and said, "Look at the formation." I looked. The Neth Sovereignty Fleet, which had begun the engagement as a coherent mass of 412 vessels in a standard assault configuration, had changed shape. The change was not tactical in any sense I could identify, not a deliberate adjustment the way the earlier formation changes had been. It was the shape that a thing takes when it has been hit many times from many directions, and the coherence that held it together is beginning to fail. Individual ship groupings that had been coordinated were now operating with gaps between them that were wider than optimal, and the gaps were not closing the way they had been closing earlier in the engagement. And the human fleet was in those gaps with the same liquid purposefulness it had been showing since the engagement began. The count in the corner of the display was not equal. It had never been equal. The human losses were real. I am not going to minimize that. Ships were destroyed and people were on those ships, but the Neth sovereignty losses were larger and they were accelerating, and the acceleration was not slowing down. And the station commander looked at the display for a long time, and then she said something that I have thought about every day since. She said, "They did the math before the fleet got here." I said, "What math?" She said, "This math." She gestured at the display at the count at the rate. She said, "Someone sat down years ago before any of this and they did the math on what it would take to make a fleet this size not want to finish what it started. And then they built the answer." I said, "How do you know they did it before?" She said, "Because you can't do that in real time. The things I'm watching them do right now took years to prepare." She paused and looked at the display again and said, "They've been ready for this. They've been ready for a long time." The Neth Sovereignty Fleet began its withdrawal at 7:12. I know that is what it was now. At the time, watching the display, I was not immediately certain what I was seeing, because the movement of 400 ships that are attempting to disengage from an ongoing engagement does not look, on a sensor return, like an orderly process. It looked, for about 20 minutes, like the kind of chaos I had been expecting since the first exchange of fire. Contacts moving in overlapping vectors, the tight coordination that had characterized the fleet's earlier movements gone, replaced by something faster and less organized. The human fleet did not immediately pursue. It held position for approximately 11 minutes while the Neth Sovereignty Fleet's withdrawal became unambiguous, and then it moved, not to cut off the withdrawal, not to pursue in force, but to maintain pressure on the rear elements of the withdrawing fleet while allowing the main body of the withdrawal to proceed. I did not understand this decision at the time. It seemed, from where I was sitting, like an opportunity not taken, a chance to continue the engagement that was being deliberately left unused. I have since read the military analysis of this decision, and I understand now that it was not restraint born of limitation. The human fleet had achieved its objective, which was the withdrawal of the attacking force. Continuing the engagement past the point of withdrawal would have served no military purpose and would have cost ships and people, and the human fleet's commanders had decided, apparently before the engagement began, where the line was between what was necessary and what was not necessary, and they stopped at the line. The Neth Sovereignty Fleet was permitted to leave, not because the human fleet could not have prevented it, because preventing it would have required crossing a line that someone had decided, in advance, was not worth crossing. The final count, which was released publicly by the human military 3 days after the engagement, was numbers I have memorized without intending to. The Neth Sovereignty Fleet that arrived in the Sol system on that morning numbered 412 vessels. The Neth Sovereignty Fleet that left the Sol system 2 hours and 29 minutes after it arrived numbered 107 vessels. The human fleet lost 63 vessels. I want to let those numbers sit for a moment because I think they deserve to sit. 412 arrived. 107 left. 305 ships did not leave in 2 hours and 29 minutes. And then the 107 that did leave faced the journey home, carrying the crews that had survived. And those crews carried what they had seen. And what they had seen was going to travel with them forever. And it was going to travel through them, back to the Neth sovereignty and into every strategic conversation and military planning session and political debate that touched on the question of Earth. And it was going to change those conversations in ways that no communique or diplomatic statement or commission resolution could have changed them, because it was real, and they had been there, and they knew. I was interviewed by a military debriefing team 48 hours after the engagement. The interview lasted 6 hours. I told them everything I had seen, in the order I had seen it, and they recorded it and asked questions, and I answered the questions as fully as I could. At the end of the interview, one of the debriefers, a colonel who had not said much during the session, asked me one question that had nothing to do with the tactical or operational information I had been providing. She asked me, "What was the moment that you knew?" I said. "Knew what?" she said. "That it was going to be okay." I thought about it. I told her honestly that I was not certain there had been a single moment. I said it had been a gradual thing, watching the display, watching the way the human fleet moved, accumulating a kind of understanding that took shape over the course of the engagement rather than arriving all at once. But then I said, "Actually, there was a moment." She asked me when. I said, "When the station commander said they'd been ready for a long time." The colonel said, "Why that moment?" I said, "Because she was looking at the same display I was looking at, and she was seeing something underneath the numbers that I wasn't quite seeing yet, and when she said it, I saw it too. That the engagement wasn't a surprise to us in the way it was supposed to be a surprise. That someone had looked at the universe we were living in, with all the species and all the politics and all the history of what happened when a powerful civilization encountered a less powerful one and decided what to do about it. And they had decided that the answer was to be ready. Not to be aggressive, not to be threatening, just to be ready. And the being ready was so complete, so obviously the product of years and years of work, that when the moment came that it was needed, it was simply there. That's when I knew. I have been asked since the engagement, many times and by many different people, what I think it means. Politicians have asked me. Journalists have asked me. Members of this council have asked me in private conversations before today's formal session. I have given different versions of the answer depending on who was asking and what they seemed to need to hear, which I am not proud of, but which is what people do. Today I am going to give you the version I actually believe, stripped of the calibration I usually apply. I think it means that someone, many someones, over a period of years that I cannot specify, looked at the situation humanity was in and thought about it carefully and without comfort or reassurance, and arrived at a conclusion that was honest even though it was not easy. The conclusion was that we were in a universe that did not guarantee our safety, that the history of every civilization that had encountered a more powerful one was not a history you would choose to repeat, and that the only meaningful response to that reality was preparation. Not provocation, not expansion, not the building of an empire or the projection of aggressive power, just preparation. The decision to be ready on the day that something came that required readiness, to be the thing that answered it correctly. I watched that decision play out on a sensor display over 2 hours and 29 minutes. I watched 412 ships become 107. I watched the human fleet hold at the line it had drawn before the engagement began. And I thought, someone knew, not who would come or when or how many ships they would bring, but that something would come, and they got ready. That is what I saw on the display at 3:47 station time, on the morning that the Neth sovereignty fleet arrived in the Sol system and did not come back. I saw the result of a decision that was made in the quiet years before anyone needed it, by people who understood that the time to build the answer is before the question is asked. I am glad they built it. I am glad I was there to see what they built. I do not ever want to be there to see something like it again, but I am glad they built it. There is one last thing I want to tell this council, and it is not tactical and it is not analytical, and it is not anything that I was asked to address today. It is personal, and I include it because I think personal things are sometimes the most accurate things, and because the thing I am going to say has been sitting in me since the morning of the engagement, and I have not been able to say it in any of the formal contexts I have been asked to speak in, and this seems like it may be my last formal context, and so I am going to say it now. When the engagement ended and the Neth sovereignty fleet was withdrawing, and the station commander and I were sitting in the monitoring room with the display still showing the aftermath of what had happened, she turned off the tactical overlay that showed the contact counts and the engagement markers and left on only the basic sensor return, which showed two things. The departure vector of the withdrawing fleet, moving away from the Sol system, and beneath it, still and unchanged as it had been before any of this began, the return signature of Earth. Just the planet. Just the blue and white contact return of Earth sitting where it had always sat, in the same position it had been in when I checked it at the start of my shift, before the proximity alarm, before any of it. The station commander looked at that return for a long time. And then she said, not to me, not to anyone in particular, just out loud in the quiet of the monitoring room, "There you are." Like she was checking on it, like she had been worried and was relieved to find it still there. I have thought about those three words more than almost anything else from that morning. There you are. It is what you say to something you love when you were afraid of losing it and didn't. It is what you say when the thing that was in danger is still there, still in its place, still the thing it was before the danger came. I think that is ultimately what all of it was for. The years of preparation and the ready fleet and the 2 hours and 29 minutes and the 305 ships that did not leave. All of it was so that someone could look at a sensor return at the end of a very long morning and say, "There you are," and mean it, and be right.